Tonight I'm going to talk on Luke's eyewitness account in Acts. Now, Christianity is a historic faith, and by this I actually mean that its validity is dependent on the truthfulness of actual historic events. So Christians claim that God is there and that he has spoken. He has intervened in human history, but how can we know that this is all true? The writer of Hebrews commences his book by saying, "In the past God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days he's spoken to us through his Son." But how do we know? Well, witnesses recorded what they saw and heard, and the testimony of these events are primarily recorded in the pages of the Bible. And tonight we're going to look at this through the eyes of a single person whom we know as Luke. But before I start on the main topic, I'll firstly summarise the nature of the New Testament. The New Testament did not emerge suddenly out of heaven, nor was it contrived by a committee. The New Testament is a collection of 27 separate documents written by supposedly 9 authors. Then I have them listed here. They are Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Paul, the writer of Hebrews, James, Peter and Jude. All of the authors were Jewish, except for Luke, who was probably a highly educated Greek God-fearer who attended synagogue prior to his Christian conversion. The New Testament documents were written at different times, mostly in the latter half of the first century, from different places and to different readers. They were originally written on papyrus scrolls, which limited their maximum size. And so that's why you observe that Matthew, Mark, Luke, John and Acts are all roughly the same size, is what you'd actually fit on a scroll. It is debatable whether the authors were conscious that they were writing sacred scripture. They may have simply been writing to meet local needs at the time. However, the readers perceived their value, copied and distributed them to other churches, and also formed them into collections for reading within local congregations and for personal use. For instance, Paul wrote 13 letters to various churches. It is likely that they were formed into a collection near the end of the first century and then widely distributed to the churches. I'm repeating myself now. Scrolls were expensive and laborious to produce. Thus, it would have taken a significant number of years for them to be widely distributed within the Roman Empire and to gain acceptance by the churches. The New Testament documents are both independent and interdependent. Paul's letters are very early, and he probably had no access to any of the 4 Gospels. On the other hand, Matthew and Luke seem to have borrowed about half of the Gospel of Mark. But they also had access to their own independent material. And the Gospel of John seems to be completely independent of the other 3 Gospels. There were other documents around. Some of these were orthodox, but written later and did not contribute anything new. Others were forgeries from heretical groups. And the churches had to decide and agree on which ones were authoritative. There were various canons, which lists the accepted documents, that were constructed over the years in which there was substantial consensus. So there was agreement in the various lists that churches came up about authoritative books, and the lists were very similar. But the canon was eventually finalised by church councils in the latter part of the 4th century. At various church councils, there was the Council of Rome, the Synod of Hippo, and the Council of Carthage. The 2 documents that will be discussed tonight are the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. Acts is a sequel to Luke, so Luke was written first and then Acts was written afterwards, and it is certain that they were written by the same author. You can tell this by just reading the first few verses in both books because they're addressed to the same person. And the Acts refers back to the previous book. The early church fathers identified the author as Luke, which will be assumed for the rest of my talk. This is difficult to prove with certainty, but it is not highly contested, and it doesn't really matter. Luke is a minor figure who is only mentioned briefly 3 times by Paul in his letters. We know most about Luke from what he wrote. Luke is a highly polished Greek writer. His Greek is better than the rest of the New Testament. He is adept at changing his style between formal and colloquial Greek to suit the context. It seems as though Greek was his first language, unlike the other Jewish New Testament authors. The key focus of this presentation is on the we passages in the Acts of the Apostles. In Acts, there are distinct passages where the author writes in the first person plural, using pronouns such as we, our, and us. If these really indicate when Luke was with Paul, then this has strong implications on the dating and reliability of the Acts of the Apostles and also Luke's Gospel. The use of we is done in a very natural and nonchalant manner. It is very easy to miss. I did not notice it myself for a number of years until it was brought to my attention. And I also know of a fellowship group or Bible study group who studied the book of Acts for a whole year and did not notice this critical feature at all. However, it is a well-recognised distinctive feature amongst biblical scholars. The first half of the Acts of the Apostles, or in the first half of the Acts of the Apostles, Luke describes the activities of the protagonists, such as Peter and Paul, and he uses the third person. He talks about he did this or they did that. However, in chapter 16, he makes a sudden switch and starts using the first person plural, using such pronouns as we, our, and us. The obvious conclusion to draw is that Luke had joined Paul during these phases of his missionary journeys. This is not a constant feature. Luke swaps between the first person and the third person at distinct points in the narrative. And this allows us to actually track segments in Paul's travels where it seems reasonable to infer that Paul was accompanied by Luke. The we passages are summarised in this table here, but we'll consider each in more detail. So there are 3 distinct sections in the book of Acts. They're from chapter 16, a small segment from verses 10 to 18, where Paul travels from Troas to Philippi. And then it stops for quite a while and picked up again in chapters 20 for around about 1.5 chapters, for halfway through chapter 21. And that goes from Philippi to Jerusalem. Then it stops. And then it picks up again in chapter 27 on the Sea Voyage from Caesarea to Rome. Alright, the first we passage occurs in Acts chapter 16, verses 6 to 10. And I'll read it out, and you notice the southern transition. Paul and his companions travelled throughout the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been kept by the Holy Spirit from preaching the word in the province of Asia. When they came to the border of Mysia, they tried to enter Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus would not allow them to. So they passed by Mysia and went down to Troas. During the night, Paul had a vision of a man of Macedonia standing and begging him, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." After Paul had seen the vision, we got ready at once to leave for Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. So it's quite subtle, isn't it? You'd hardly notice it. This transition occurred at Alexandria and Troas, which was an ancient Greek city on the northern east tip of Turkey. So you can see it there at the beginning of the red line. And so the first A few verses in chapter 16 describe this trip from Troas to Philippi. From Troas, the company sailed to Samothrace, Neapolis, and then travelled to Philippi, a Roman colony and the leading city of that district of Macedonia. So you can see Philippi in the region of Macedonia. In Philippi, Paul cast an evil spirit out of a fortune-telling slave girl, taking away her gift. The owner complained to the authorities, and so Paul and Silas were imprisoned. After Paul was released, he told the magistrate of his Roman citizenship, and so the magistrate politely asked him to leave the city. At this point, the wee passages stopped for a significant time. Paul and Silas then travelled to Thessalonica, Berea, Athens, and then to Corinth. I don't think that shows Corinth, but Corinth is further south from Athens. Paul then stayed in Corinth for 18 months. This sojourn can be accurately dated from the end of 49 AD to mid-51 AD. It's an 18-month period. While he was in Corinth, he wrote 2 of his letters, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Paul then travelled to Syrian Antioch via Caesarea, Ephesus in Turkey, Caesarea in Palestine. He then visited various places in Galatia, Phrygia, which is in Turkey, and then returned to Ephesus again, where he stayed for just over 2 years. Paul then travelled to Macedonia and then Achaia, which is Greece, where he stayed for 3 months. He then returned to Philippi in Macedonia. This is a really complicated map.
So Kevin, just another one. I think it's also fair to say that Corinth, he wrote Romans, that great doctrinal book. I think he said Thessalonians, but I think it was because right at the end he talked about the guy who was I guess a leading figure in Corinth. He gives greetings from.
He might have been. I think he went back to Corinth. He was in Corinth between 49 and 50 AD.
Yes.
And it's clear that he wrote 1 and 2 Thessalonians from that.
Yes.
And Romans was probably written about 7 years later. But this was not really important. But the order was Thessalonians,
Yes.
1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and then Romans. And you can trace the sequence of them by his own writings, by seeing them, because he's doing a collection for the poor. So in 1 Corinthians he's organising it, 2 he's picking it up, in Romans he's taking it back to Jerusalem.
In Romans he actually specifically right at the end reads from the person who is the leading, I guess, figure. I forget the leading, you know.
No.
The leading guy who's a leading citizen of Corinth.
It's not on my copy.
Sorry, I shut up.
I'm sure Matt will support me.
Go on.
Maybe not. Okay. Alright. Luke travels to Jerusalem. When he sailed from Philippi to Troas, the wee passages resumed. The interlude has been over 4 years. And note that Philippi was the drop-off point for Luke, and Luke rejoined Paul from the same location. Alright, so they stopped in Philippi, Paul went round and round for 4 years, came back to Philippi, bang, they start again.
So Luke was just hanging out there for 4 years.
Sorry?
Luke was just hanging out there for 4 years.
Well, they suspect it was actually his hometown.
And
He might have
he
been.
was over the other side and he just caught a lift because he needed to get back home.
Yep, that's right. Sounds like a good theory. Alright. So after staying in Troas for 7 days, which is point 9 on that map, so you can see that? So here's Philippi, point 8, point 9, Troas. Alright. Luke then sailed to Assos, but Paul went by foot. Paul was then taken on board at Assos. Then they sailed to Caesarea via Mytilene, Chios, Miletus, Kos, Rhodes, Patara, Tyre, and Ptolemais. And so it just follows those sequences. There's Mytilene, I mentioned Miletus, Patara, Tyre, Ptolemais, then Caesarea. From Caesarea they travelled overland and arrived at Jerusalem, and this was probably in the year 57 AD. Luke then provides us with some very important information. He says, when we arrived at Jerusalem, the brothers received us warmly. Notice us, okay? The next day, Paul and the rest of us went to see James, who is Jesus' brother. And all the elders were present. From this reference, it is reasonable to infer that Luke was introduced to James, Jesus' brother, as well as to the church in Jerusalem. This would have included other eyewitnesses to Jesus' life and ministry. Paul then participated in a purification rite at the temple to show that he still adhered to the Jewish law. However, he was recognised by some of the Jews from the province of Asia. Asia is another name for Turkey in those times. And they started a riot. To cut a long story short, Paul was arrested and taken to Caesarea, which is on the coast, having been in Jerusalem for only 12 days. Paul was then imprisoned at Caesarea for 2 years. When Paul was taken to Caesarea, the wing passages stopped. So where was Luke while Paul was at Caesarea? It seems reasonable to suppose that he stayed with the church in Jerusalem. Paul initially appeared before Felix, who was a governor, but Felix left him in jail for 2 years until he was replaced by another fellow called Porcius Festus, and this occurred in 59 AD. Paul was then interviewed by Festus and Herod Agrippa II, and even though Paul is assessed as innocent, he is sent to Rome because of his appeal to Caesar. He said, I'm a Roman citizen and therefore I can appeal my case before Caesar in Rome. At this stage, we will read the entirety of chapter 27. This is concerning a sea voyage from Caesarea to Malta. Listen to it carefully. Note all the vivid details regarding the places visited and the details regarding operation of the ship during the storm, and make a judgment for yourself whether you think that Luke was actually there. So the wee passages continued until hit Jerusalem. Paul was then taken to Caesarea, held in jail for 2 years, appealed to Caesar. As soon as the sea voyage starts back to Rome, the wee passages recommence. Okay. When it was decided that we should sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to the centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded a ship from Andromidium, about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia, and we put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. The next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so that they might provide for his needs. From there we put out to sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. When we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Cnidus. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite Salmonia. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens, near the town of Lacia. Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was the fast. So Paul warned them, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, and to our own lives also." But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and the owner of the ship. Since the harbour was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbour in Crete, facing both southwest and northwest. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they thought that they had obtained what they wanted. So they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force called the northeaster swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. When the men had hoisted it aboard, they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together. Fearing that they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. After the men had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost, only the ship will be destroyed." Last night an angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve, stood beside me and said, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island." On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea, when about midnight the sailors sensed they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending that they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved." So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it fall away. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. "For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head." After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether there were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. When daylight came, they did not recognise the land. They saw a bay with a sandy beach, where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea, and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. They then hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach, but the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow stuck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners, to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land in safety. Okay, what do you think? Was he there?
I reckon.
Yeah.
Acts 28 describes a subsequent trip to Rome, where Paul is placed under house arrest, and the book of Acts finishes with the following statement. For 2 whole years, Paul stayed there in his own rented house and welcomed all who came to see him. Boldly and without hindrance, he preached the kingdom of God and taught about the Lord Jesus Christ. But the issue is, I wonder what happened after that. Paul would have arrived in Rome in AD 60. And Luke mentions that he was under house arrest in Rome for 2 years. That is where Luke's writings end. What followed was tumultuous. Paul was due to appear before the Emperor Nero, but what was the outcome of Paul's trial? We're not told. The persecutions of Nero started in 64 AD. So there was a fire in Rome. Nero blamed the Christians, and he had them put on stakes in his garden and burnt them. It was horrific. Don't hear about that. Paul, James and Peter were all executed in the mid-60s. Acts records the martyrdoms of Stephen and James, the son of Zebedee. Why not these latter ones? The Jewish wars commenced in 66 AD. The Jewish temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. Why did Luke not mention these things? The obvious explanation is that Luke completed the book of Acts shortly after Paul's house arrest, and he probably wrote it during that time.
The scroll got full, he had no more room in it.
Sorry?
The scroll got full.
Yeah, right, okay. Damn. It's quite possible that Luke was also a victim of the persecutions of Nero. Now that we've looked at the book of Acts, what are the implications on the Gospel of Luke, which is the first document that he wrote? The Gospel of Luke was written prior to Acts, in which Luke commences with the following words. Look at them carefully. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled amongst us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account to you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Luke makes 5 key claims within this prologue. He consulted prior writings. He spoke to eyewitnesses. He conducted a careful investigation. He wrote an orderly account, so that the reader may have certainty regarding what actually happened. Well, when did he do most of this investigation?
Yeah, what she said.
When he was in Jerusalem.
He would have done the
Clarity.
When he's talking
Articulate.
to James and the other
Yeah.
apostles, according to Acts.
Yeah.
and he would have done the writing in Rome. Find out the end.
Possibly Caesarea though, because remember Paul was in prison for a long time in Caesarea, wasn't he? So he might have had access to go back up and speak to them from Caesarea.
For a while.
Yeah. It was probably during his 2-year stay in Jerusalem while Paul was imprisoned at Caesarea. During this time we know that he at least met James, brother of Jesus, who could have provided him with the family background information on Jesus that is provided in the first 2 chapters of his Gospel.
Why was he in Jerusalem? Because he gives a very accurate account in Acts of the trials that performed. I would have thought Luke might have actually been in Caesarea.
Well, he joined Paul afterwards. He could have picked up the information up
Yeah.
from Paul.
But he gives some fairly good accounts.
Yeah, well, some people think he actually went to Caesarea but didn't actually know his presence.
Okay.
Although there currently exists no scholarly consensus on the we passages, 3 interpretations in particular have become dominant. The first is that the writer was a genuine historical witness, eyewitness, just as he said. When he said we, he was there. The second is that the writer was a redactor. I'll explain that. And the third is it was a stylistic convention. So firstly, we'll look at the historical eyewitness theory. The historical eyewitness interpretation states that the we passages indicate that the writer was a historical eyewitness. This remains the most influential opinion within current biblical studies. Objections to this viewpoint mainly take the form of the following 2 interpretations, but also include the claim that Luke and Acts contain differences in theology and historical narrative which are not reconcilable with the authentic letters of Paul. The redactor theory, this is the second one listed. The redactor interpretation claims that the we passages are an earlier written or oral source incorporated into Acts by a later redactor. So a redactor was an editor who gathered together material. This view still acknowledges the apparent historicity of these texts, and that they were eyewitness accounts, but it views the we passages as being distinct from the main work. However, this view has been criticised for failing to provide sufficient evidence of a distinction between the source text and the document into which it was incorporated. So if he was incorporating other fragments, we fragments were incorporated, you'd expect them to be a different style from the rest of the text, but they're not. The third theory was that it was a stylistic convention. The stylistic convention interpretation claims that the use of the first person plural is a deliberate stylistic device which was common to this type of genre, but which was not intended to indicate historical eyewitness. Since a number of the we passages are associated with ship voyages, some scholars claim that the we passages are a literary convention typical of shipboard voyages in travel romance literature of this period. This view has the following problems. Nobody has found such appropriate parallels or the existence of such a stylistic convention. And the other thing is, Acts does not belong to this genre. Now the fourth theory, I've got a picture of a nice looking man here. This is Bart Ehrman. Apart from the above commonly held view, sceptical New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman claims that the we passages are deliberate deceptions, designed to convince readers that the author was a travelling companion of Paul, even though in fact he was not. According to Ehrman, the we passages are written by someone falsely claiming to have been a travelling companion of Paul, in order to present the untrue idea that the author had first-hand knowledge of Paul's views and activities, and Acts of the Apostles is thereby shown to be a forgery. Ehrman's views are not widely supported, but it does indicate how threatening the we passages are to those good skeptics. By far the most predominant view is that Luke was an actual eyewitness who accompanied Paul on some of his missionary journeys. Early Christian Writings is a predominantly sceptical website. Even so, the commentator from the Early Christian Writings website provides this assessment. This nonchalant and matter-of-fact dovetailing convinces me that the author of Acts was among those who were left behind at Philippi and joined up with Paul to sail from there later. The distinction between Paul and us discredits the idea that the first-person perspective in these passages is some kind of literary device, which would take the perspective of Paul, for example, increasing the drama of Paul's adventure or increasing the connection of Paul to the group, and for which there is no precedent in ancient literature. The alternative is that the author of Acts was making a false affectation to being a companion of Paul. This prompts the question of why the author made this claim in such a subtle way, instead of ensuring that the reader could not miss it by emphasising the point, as apocryphal writers often did. It also leaves us wondering as to why the false claim to participation is restricted to a few passages, leaving Paul alone for most of the narrative, though this is understandable if the author's participation was in fact sporadic. The most probable conclusion is that Luke had travelled with Paul at times, a fact of which Luke's patron, Theophilus, was already aware. It seems fairly certain that Luke accompanied Paul on many of his missionary journeys between about 49 AD and 62 AD. He accompanied Paul to Jerusalem and met James, the brother of Jesus. He thus had direct access to eyewitnesses and family members of Jesus of Nazareth. One of the characteristics of the Gospel of Luke is his numerous accounts of Jesus' contact with women. It may just be that many of those women were still part of the church at Jerusalem while Luke was there between 57 and 59 AD. Mary, the mother of Jesus, was at least an initial member of this church. Thus she may have still been there during Luke's visit. If not, there would have been others who could have recalled Mary's testimony. Our last word from Luke is at the end of Acts, while Paul is under house arrest. However, it is not the last word about Luke. Paul's second letter to Timothy was Paul's last letter. It was written after his defence, which seems to have gone rather poorly. He is no longer under house arrest. He is now bound with chains in a Roman prison, and he states that the time has come for my departure. The Neronian persecution is about to begin. Many of Paul's friends had either deserted him or had left Rome for other cities, except one person. In chapter 4, verse 11, Paul states, "Only Luke is with me." At that time, it was very dangerous to be associated with Paul. The next personal information about Luke comes from Irenaeus in Against Heresies, where he records Luke also, the companion of Paul, recorded in the book, the Gospel preached by him, meaning Paul. Luke does not identify himself in his writings. He only intrudes his personality in a subtle and nonchalant way. However, if you have eyes to see, then you can feel his personality. I am sure that Luke would agree with John when he said, "We proclaim to you what we have seen and heard, so that you may have fellowship with us, and our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. We write this to make our joy complete." When I studied this feature, it really gave me fresh insight into Luke's writings, and I really could feel the man. It is there clearly for all to see. I encourage you to reread Luke's writings and identify these things for yourself. So most of the material that I presented this morning is derived directly from the Acts of the Apostles and also the Gospel of Luke. However, I found these websites useful. First one is Wikipedia, which is a source of all authority, and also from the early Christian writing site. So thank you, that's it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I think at this stage we'll have a break for supper, and then afterwards we'll reorganise the chairs in a circle and have an open discussion.
I don't think I did, because what I started on was to say that history really matters in Christianity. So Christianity is dependent on the truthfulness of historic events, unlike some other religions. They might just be teaching about ethical principles, so that historical context doesn't matter, but it does to Christianity. So that's the first point I made. And the second point was the nature of the New Testament. That it's,
Yeah, I would say.
Yeah, but
That's a good point.
What about the implications?
Yeah. Yeah. What do you think? Gee. I think some of the implications. So one of the ones I was telling you about during the break was that in Luke 21, there's bits in there where Jesus predicts, where Luke records Jesus' predictions that the temple would be destroyed. But based on the timeline that you were giving us here, it's clearly obvious that Luke definitely wrote Luke, like the Gospel, and quite probably wrote Acts as well, before 64 AD, which is when Nero goes nuts, which means that he's writing significantly earlier than when the temple's actually destroyed, which means that Jesus made a very good bet. That when Jesus says, "I know that you think that this building is impregnable," which is how that text starts, that you think it's invincible and it would never break down, well, it's going to be destroyed really soon. And that kind of that's a very bold bet for Luke to feel confident to put into his text before it's actually happened. That shows that Jesus is very, very clever and very good at predicting impossible things. So, anyway, that's one implication of it.
Yeah. Somebody actually asked whether or not what we talked about tonight was that you, Ray? What's controversial? Is there anyone think that it is controversial, or is everyone pretty much persuaded that Luke was on that boat?
I'm persuaded.
Well, I think based on what Matt was just saying, from a general non-Christian perspective, that does make it controversial.
Okay, because
Because here we have this big prediction from many years before, and if we have got near enough proof that it was written before that was fulfilled, then that means that there was something significant in the original edition that we pay special attention to.
And more particularly, it's the overall veracity of Luke is what you really demonstrate on Luke. Because that was my take from what we heard. Luke is a genuine author.
Yeah.
God who was used is a genuine author.
Okay.
I think it might be possible that Luke wasn't, or the author of Acts on Luke wasn't the one that was on the boat. It's possible that he was, say, interviewing someone, and that person was speaking like this. He was saying, and then we did this and we did that. And so, but Luke would go through and he'd say, they did this and they did that, and then maybe he made a mistake and wrote we and started writing what the person was actually relaying to him, and then realised again, oh no, let's keep going, and then kept saying they. I thought that might be a possibility.
That's just as speculative as saying he was on the boat.
Well, yeah, I mean, they both seem to be maybe equal.
I would suggest that maybe that's a bit more simply, because the straightforward reading of the text is that he's just there for those bits. That's what's straightforward. But then it's not impossible that there's other, like it's not impossible that that's the case, and he just got to put the quote marks because they weren't in.
Yeah, well, the thing that struck me is like they stopped at Philippi, then there was a 4-year interlude, and it started from Philippi again, which kind of fits the pattern. That makes sense.
So do you favour that view? I mean,
Well, I was just thinking that might be a possibility.
Okay.
One way though.
That the author, and that's why you wouldn't see any difference between those passages and what he'd just written previously, because he was just writing down what someone else said, and then he accidentally just began writing down actually word for word what he was saying.
It is plausible, but one of the things which Kevin brought out tonight is that Luke was very careful on all that he did. Kevin brought out those points from the beginning of his gospel. Just pointing out how meticulous Luke was on all his points. So it's hard to imagine he could have actually made a mistake like that.
Well, I was just thinking if you're writing for that long.
Yeah, I don't know.
That's not.
I think it's still an interesting point to play with, because what it does is it says, yeah, there are other possibilities. But, as Perry's pointed out, Perry just then, it's less plausible than the most straightforward reading. Right? So the most straightforward reading is Luke wrote it, and he's writing it out from his own personal experience. But the further away you get from the most plausible thing, that usually correlates to the more you want it to be something else. You know what I mean? So the reason why I think that's valuable is that shows that people who want Luke to not do this, to have not written this, really want that. And that's significant because often when we're talking to people who are skeptics or something like that, they try to present themselves as being very objective. I don't have any vested interest in this at all. I'm actually being very, you're the desperate Christian trying to make mumbo jumbo sound credible. This actually indicates that if you're going down that line and coming up with what Urban's coming, I mean, that Urban's in that category is pretty desperate. Then the question is, why is he so desperate? And he's desperate because he really doesn't want it to be real. And that actually damages his objectivity and therefore his credibility.
I wasn't saying it in that sense because I've never actually heard anyone else put that forward before. But it doesn't make a difference for me because even if he was talking to someone else, that person was having to be an eyewitness.
In one sense, what we just heard tonight harks right back to the very first presentation given by Bruce and dealt with the accuracy of the New Testament. One of the things we focused on was the accuracy of Luke. And so many historical details. We didn't focus on it tonight, I know, but
Yeah, we're just focusing on one
section.
section.
Possibly second for this.
Yeah.
He's so accurate in all his other historical points, so that he seemed to know what was going on at the time, because he was writing.
Yeah, all those towns along they're all correct.
Yeah.
And who was, who was there, Luke, who was in charge of him at the time?
Yeah, like Felix and Festus
Yeah.
and Herod, and these are all historical.
That's right.
So, I'd like to perhaps find out from someone who wouldn't necessarily say they're a Christian, but who to what their perspective is on having heard those. Do you think?
That makes sense.
Do you think?
I'm just going to stick my neck out because I couldn't back this up. But I've been reading Barbara Pitt, and when I was looking at that, it seemed pretty complicated. And she claims that she can prove what she says. It's in the consistency of interpretation throughout the New Testament. But I just looked at bits and pieces at the evidence of those bits and pieces and saw whether this makes sense. And to me, it makes sense. So like the birth of Jesus right through to the crucifixion, and even this, it sort of makes sense, a lot of it. And the evidence she gives is reasonable. But there's a lot of things that you have to follow numbers and dates and calendars, and I just don't know what about. But she says that, like John's the beloved disciple.
Yeah.
Now this is going to be absolute. You've asked for someone who's a bit dicey.
Well,
And she says that the beloved is like an office, a term that is used, because Luke was the beloved disciple as well, a beloved position.
Yeah.
Beloved position. And what it is that when you have perhaps a husband and wife situation, and they're not supposed to meet at all, maybe husband and someone, there's a go-between. And the beloved is the go-between. It's his office to go between one person and another, a husband and a wife. I don't want to say it too clear. Husband and a wife.
getting it, yeah.
You're getting it. And so those two, they are so, the go-between is so identified with the husband and so identified with the wife that he speaks not for himself but for the other one, the son of the other person, to each other. And the term for him was we, the plural is we. He's seen as
An ambassador kind of role.
very close in personal things, but that was the term that's used. It is meant to be like a disguise. In this business, Luke is the beloved position. He is in that position between Jesus and some other lady, Mary Magdalene, which in this view is Mary Magdalene was Jesus as well. And Jesus was supposed to be crucified and brought to heaven, and so they can't say Jesus is with us, so they use the term we. And wherever the term we is in that, it really means that Jesus is present, but they're just not telling them. So that's controversial.
Sure.
Don't
But on what we've heard tonight, does that seem like a strong argument for saying that that's when you were listening to Acts 27 and Luke's description of what was happening and and everything that is a good fit?
I would be able to say.
You sure?
Yeah.
I think there was something where you were saying that Luke, that they ended up on an island and were talking about weird, and at the end of it, 4 years later, coming back to weird and that sort of thing. That all I was going to say, from my point of view, I wouldn't say Jesus is still with us.
But Jesus is not coming into this story at all. He's not in the picture in this story at all. It's Paul. Paul's the main guy in this story.
They're going to Rome.
Yeah.
And they're going to Rome because they believe that the end of the age is about to come. And that business of God coming down and separating the nations and the sheep and the goats and all that.
In this particular text, they're going to Rome because Paul
Is on trial.
is on trial and has been arrested and has been taken to Rome.
It's appeal to Caesar, which is, we know, as a Roman citizen could do, so it's completely authentic.
So the
process then.
So that that other the understanding that everyone's coming to Rome for the end of the world doesn't fit this particular story, even if it fits some other.
Apparently it fits some other one.
Well, it might, but if you actually read the Bible, which is what we've been doing tonight, and you've heard this piece of text, this in this case, do you think? I mean,
I wouldn't see what I said about Barbara theory if I just read that. No.
Right. Yeah.
Possibly, no, and possibly the more pieces you looked at yourself, the more that would seem to be the case. We might suggest.
Other than it being looking at the word we in the context of a skeptic or an atheist challenging the word,
Right.
and us, if I use the word us, the Christians trying to defend the word.
Right.
Other than that, how important is this?
Yeah.
How important is the word we to Christians? Other than defending the faith.
I think this comes back to that implications. I think that comes back to the implications question. Because you're right, like, I mean, really, does it matter whether Luke was on the boat? Like, you know, at the end of the day, it probably doesn't. Except that what it actually creates a chain of events. What it does is it gives us a time stamp. So that's the first thing. The second thing that it does is it creates associations for Luke. It means that there is evidence, literary evidence, of Luke hanging out with Paul, first of all, which is kind of handy, but also having had extensive interactions, or at least some pretty meaningful interactions, with Jesus, James's brother, and eyewitness apostles to Jesus. So those things become fairly significant, because it's kind of like when you're looking at Luke Acts, you want to sit down and say to Luke, well, what's your resume? What's on your resume to actually be qualified to write an account of this? Did you hang around with Jesus? And he goes, well, no, sorry. But I do have evidence here on my resume of hanging out with these people, and I wrote all this stuff down before it became kind of already happened, like, you know, with the apoplectic stuff. So that's the kind of value of it. If you don't have the we's, then you can't actually make some of those links as powerfully as you can.
I think they're still there. It's just this is pretty sharp.
This kind of clinches it for Luke to have a lot of credibility that he otherwise wouldn't have.
I think one of the criticisms of our gospel is that it was gradually invented through the centuries.
Yeah.
This does not read like this.
No.
It reads as an eyewitness.
Yeah, no, the theory that it gradually was written over the centuries fits what we're reading here tonight, about as well as the Barbara theory of the beloved. I think, you know, in terms of what's actually on the page and how it can be matched for the date. Doesn't mean that their theology is right. It just dates it, you know.
This comes back to Kevin's earlier point about the historicity of the Gospels matter. So, let's take another example from Acts. After Acts, about Acts 3, Peter and John are taken before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish government, and by Annas and Caiaphas, and they are told, shut the hell up. And they respond with, we don't care what you say, Jesus is risen from the dead, what do we care about you? Now that's just over a month after those very same people killed Jesus. So that's a pretty remarkable transformation to have happened in a month. For them to not be absolutely scared out of their wits, these two people. And the reason is because Jesus is risen from the dead. So if Jesus is risen from the dead, anyone who kills me, I know what's happening to me. And these people think they won against Jesus. Now, that's a pretty important apologetic claim for the legitimacy of the historicity of the resurrection. That leads to the next question is, well, how do I know that Luke actually is really on the money there and not just making that up? How do I know that he's not writing 120 AD and, you know, ages after it just sort of like... And the answer is because of the we passages. You know, so
Even though in the we passages, it's nothing to do
yeah,
with
the we passages have nothing to do with that, but they connect the whole thing to give him the credibility to actually say that. So then so the we passages are kind of a piggyback onto the question of, do you think Jesus rose from the dead? And if he did raise from the dead, then you've got to really think about the implications of that for your life.
And of course, the Acts, the veracity of Acts that we read here in turn gives great credence to the gospel, which is the preceding account.
Yeah.
Which is in turn.
Yes, I find it interesting, if you read the Gospel of Luke, then you read Acts. A lot of there's very little contextual detail in Luke, in the Gospel of Luke, but there's heaps of it in Acts. In terms of places, events, people, and there's a heap of stuff that can actually be cross-checked in Acts. Less so in Luke. Sorry?
Yeah, because it's got big mark.
Yeah,
Well,
but
there,
the point is, yes, he's more remote from the information
Well,
in Luke. It's further back.
Right at the beginning, John the Baptist, he was very precise in this, Tiberius, with
Yeah,
Tiberius.
I'm not saying he's deficient, but there's far more contextual detail in Acts because it's a lot closer to him, and he saw a lot of it. He's familiar with it.
Now, it's been a bit quiet over there, so as the person who's supposed to make it like so everyone gets, so please, someone over there talk. Oh, did I do that? It'd be fun to leave.
I have one comment. I heard a sermon about these passages last year or the year before, I haven't read, and a comment was made by somebody who was coming from a marine maritime background.
Yep.
And he was saying that if you're going to put all this detailed information in about the things that happened on the ship during the storm, and you were going to research it, you would probably make sure that was fairly accurate, that you actually had all the right terms and all the rest of it. And what you see in Luke is not from a mariner, it comes from another person who just sort of sees tackle or this and this, and it's not actually very
Nautical.
yes,
They put a rope under the boat. I'm sure there's a more technical term for it than that. Sort of thing.
Right,
So,
so it's written from a person who is a non-sailor.
Yeah.
And, but if you were going to include something like that, you might sort of, go to the right people to sort of, ask questions.
But he still knew the geography and the...
Yeah, he knew the geography, but,
Well, he says it seems authentic because it's how a layman would describe it, not as a sailor would
Yes.
describe it.
And if you were going to make it up, you'd make sure that it sounded like a sailor had done it.
Actually, if you were going to make it up, you probably wouldn't have gone into so much detail in those bits, and would have actually sort of more the theological implications or the major events that happened, like Paul being tried at Rome.
Remember, of course, they spent most of the winter season on Malta, and I'm sure they discussed what they'd just been through, so I'm sure that Luke, he was on what was, we believe he was. We picked up a lot from those that survived the shipwreck and probably refined his account to discuss what they'd just been through.
do you know what island they were actually sort of,
Stuck on Malta. Malta, yeah.
I've actually been to St Paul's Bay and seen where they came ashore.
sorry?
I've actually been to St Paul's Bay and I've seen where they came ashore. It's quite a large sheltered bay there.
Did you find the world remains of the snake?
you should bring that into the boat.
Just a quick question, so I'm not totally confused. Are you referring then to the we reference as the fact that might be hidden?
That might be what, sorry?
Hidden code, maybe?
No. This is just straightforward. I'm going to tell you what happened to me on that boat because it was a big deal in my life, and here's the story of what happened. There's no code. I don't think.
Yep.
I mean, I'm
That
referring
is
back
the
to
argument.
business.
Okay. The argument is he's just using it in a very natural sense, as we would.
Yeah.
But
We meaning us.
But the implications of him having travelled around with this group of people is that suddenly he has access to information that's much more closer to first-hand information about Jesus, and therefore that gives extra credibility and veracity to what he's claiming. Because if he's writing, you know, 4th, 5th generation afterwards, he might be saying something that's nice or possibly could be correct, but it doesn't have that same sense of immediate veracity, you know. So yeah.
And you believe his writings have been spot on?
Pretty much.
Doesn't flower things up.
Well, the way he mentions it's the laws of who's in charge of here, and then we've got independent historic papers with one possible exception right at the beginning of the book. Everything else can be matched to his history.
Well, even making an error of history shows that you were, you know, you're trying to, like he was, you know.
It would be like asking who was the Australian Prime Minister in 2013.
Yeah.
And the answer is?
Well, it's kind of 2, isn't it? Yeah. 3 of, yeah. I forgot about that. Not bad.
Somebody make a note of that.
Can I just say one more thing?
Yeah.
The gap, the 4-year gap, where was he, do you think, in that time?
Philippi.
He was...
In Philippi.
So it's kind of like...
So the weak passages stop at Philippi.
Luke.
And he's not in prison or...
No. People suspect that Philippi was his hometown.
Bring the map up just to show.
Yeah, sure. I'll chuck that up, please.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of, I mean, when Kevin was telling the story, he was saying, you see, the weak passages stop in Philippi, and 4 years later, the weak passages start again in Philippi. So the assumption is, for that 4 years, he was in Philippi.
So it starts off here.
Did you write anything in 4 years? Nothing like that we can see yet.
Nothing that came through to us.
Well, his first trip with Paul was very short. Maybe he's just kind of warming up to the general idea during that time.
So the idea is that Luke and, like, as a posse, they all go over to Philippi, and then Luke says, hey, I'm just hanging out here. Maybe he's doing ministry, he's planning a church there or something like that, or maybe he's, you know,
Well, Paul didn't leave people behind him.
Yeah, and then Paul keeps on going and everything like that, but then on his way back, Paul lands in Philippi, and then the weak passages start all over again, because now they're actually back together. So then Luke isn't writing as an eyewitness during this period. What Luke's doing is he's just saying, oh, Paul told me this, Paul told me that, Paul told me about when this happened, and so on and so forth. And when he was in Berea, they were really nice. In Thessalonica, they were a bunch of jerks. And then we got back to Philippi, and then he came back to Philippi, and we all started off again. That kind of
So is that a reference for when he's with Paul?
Pardon?
Is that a reference for
When he's with Paul, exactly.
Yeah. So Kevin underlined, when he put up the text of the Bible, he underlined pronouns, and he showed that for the section from Philippi and around about and down and back to Philippi was they, them, Paul and his companions, not we.
Sorry, I think it is just a little bit off topic. 1 year from now, we're going to be celebrating Australians coming ashore just north of Troas. It's very interesting to note that deliberately, as much as we hold in sacred memory here in Australia, actually planted our troops in a place of great historic significance in so many ways. Yes, from the New Testament, that's where things happen. It's where Xerxes invaded across that's what's Troy. Ancient Troy was actually just a bit north of Troas. We read about Achilles and all the others. Our troops were within 20 or 30 kilometres of that. They small gap across the Hellespont. So all of that, including the biblical accounts, Philippi has got a lot of significance. And I just wonder, back in the days, 100 years ago, our diggers would have known their Bible a lot better. And I just wonder how many of them would have recognised the significance of where they were going, because they were right in the centre of where so much of this happened. Coming from this far-flung land, way over here over the horizon, to a place where so much of historic significance happens.
I was wondering why Paul appealed to Caesar if he was going to be found innocent anyway. Did he just want a taxpayer-funded missionary trip to Rome?
It was because the Romans wanted to send him back to Jerusalem to put his defence before the Jewish authorities. And Paul thought after what happened last time I was in Jerusalem, I'm not going to get a fair trial there, they're just going to kill me.
And he was already in jail for 2 years and you get the check of that. So if he was going to get put back in jail for another 5 years, he got either to go to Caesar.
And I also think it's a bit like people who want their day in court. They don't want the sort of settlement elements behind the background. They actually, they want their day. He wanted to put his case to Rome. Yeah.
Paul also knew that Rome was the centre of the empire, and for the gospel that was the best place to go and take it.
Remember when he was first blind on the road to Damascus, he was knights told him, you are to give testimony to kings. That was a proxy made to him right from the moment.
It was part of his calling.
It was. So,
Another word that Kevin used right at the beginning of this book tonight was the word canon, defining how and why certain things came to be what we call scripture in the Bible, and why there are others that were equally good, so far as we may think they might have thought at the time were excluded. And they had to have some direct connection with Jesus to be good enough to go in the Bible. Yeah. And so, how did Luke fit into that? It's because he was accepted way back right at the very beginning as having spent a lot of time with Paul. Mm. And so, whenever we may think now, looking back over a lot of history and what we can see from here, we can see certain stuff, but right back where they had much better knowledge of what had happened and who had done what, they accepted Luke because they believed Luke had been Paul for quite some period of time.
And I think this comes back to Kevin's point at the very beginning about historicity. So why do Christians really care? Why do we care about historicity? The reason we care about historicity of this stuff is because the chief point of the gospel is not just that Jesus gave us some really good ethics or some really good ideas for us to follow. It's not like Buddha or someone like that who gives us ethical or philosophical teachings that we then go, can see your point with that. Well, that is a part of it, it's not the part of it. The central thing that makes Christians Christians is that they believe that there was an historical event that was pretty remarkable, and that is that Jesus said, I'm actually God's son and I'll prove it to you by dying and then rising again. And that he died and then he rose again. And that pretty much proves that he's God's son and he's someone that you should really respect. You can't, you can't just say, oh, he's got cool teachings. You actually have to say that he's God, based on that implication. So the historicity matters because it's not just about people like Luke or Paul or anyone saying, I think Jesus is okay. It's actually about them being in the position to say, I have eyewitness evidence to say that this really happened. Right? So when Luke is able to say, I hung around with James, Jesus' brother, and I think we all have brothers who it'd take a fair bit of convincing to convince my brothers that I've risen from the dead. Or that I was God. If they're thinking that, if James can actually say, he was my brother, and sometimes I thought he was a complete jerk because of his arrogance at thinking he was so spectacular, Jesus. And Luke actually records Luke acting, James acting that way. But I realised when he actually rose from the dead, maybe he'd been right. Okay, when you have that kind of a thing happening, you then have to start to say, well, maybe Jesus did really rise from the dead, and they're not making this stuff up.
Yeah,
I was impressed in the story that while there was all this detail about 3 sea anchors being thrown at the back and the waves, they couldn't put the power into the waves, they were beaten by the storm and turned around and the back part of the boat got damaged and all sorts of things. In amongst all of that, we've got Paul, just a lowly prisoner on a boat that's got a lot of people on it, 260 or something. 76. 270. he makes an attempt to influence the whole boat early on. He says, let's not travel, we're going to have a disaster.
Well, if you know a bit about Paul, from as most of us do, it's not out of character, is it?
He gets into several disasters, but in this occasion...
No, but he's also pretty bold in putting forward his...
On this occasion, he's inspired by the Holy Spirit to prophesy that there is a lot of trouble ahead.
Yeah.
And no one will listen to him. They all decide they're going to go anyway.
Yeah.
And then it's like,
But later on, he talks again. They are prepared this time to listen to him.
Yeah.
He built a case supernaturally,
Yeah.
and then he says, every one of you are going to survive.
Mm.
And they go, oh.
Yeah. It's really bold,
nice.
isn't it?
Maybe we'd like to believe that.
Now, when he says, and this is a bit off topic too, but when he says, you won't lose a hair from your head.
Yeah.
Now, how far should we push that? I think that might be hyperbole.
I would say...
It wouldn't have been the case if I was there.
I would say that's a common expression used today, and it's been common ever since the day of Paul.
Yes, of course it is. I guess
We
I'm
don't
just
mean
pointing
it
out that you
even
can't,
today.
if you take a rigid view of every little phrase in the Bible, you
I
can...
lose about 50 hairs every morning.
Yeah.
There is another storm account within the book of Jones, where again God is glorified, even though initially it seems like it's a disaster about to happen. There's a strange echo in Jones.
Is it Jasmine? Now, you've never been here tonight.
She's been here tonight.
You've never been here before tonight.
I think it's wrong to talk to you earlier.
Oh, sorry.
You made a mistake there.
Yeah, okay. So, like, have you ever read this passage before? This story is familiar to a lot of us. Was it familiar to you?
Well, I know Kevin gave me Luke, and I read that, so I'm not too familiar with this story, but there's a bit of things I do understand because
You've read the book of Luke.
yeah. Kevin also mentioned about the book of Acts, and I think it's based on it, so you just give me an introduction to, what is the background and actually read that particular book. Yeah.
Okay. So there's Luke, and then this is like the sequel, Acts. Yeah. So what did? Okay. So you've
Just a bit more than that it's called Acts. The sequel is about after Jesus was dead and rose again. What did the church do for the first, 30 years? What did they do? What did they? How did things go from there? And so this happens in chapter 28. There's only about 27. There's only about 28 chapters, and so this comes at the end of Acts. But it's basically the basic story of Acts is that the church is heavily persecuted because people don't like the idea of Jesus rising from the dead. But the church seems to be able to expand at every point. And so this guy, Paul started off as a person persecuting the church and wanting to squash it, but then actually became convinced of its message and said, actually no, Jesus did really rise from the dead, and became one of its chief kind of advocates, to the point where he got into lots of trouble as well. So the basic premise of Acts is that the church is being suppressed for its beliefs, and not just its beliefs, its knowledge of what happened to Jesus, that he rose again. And then also that doesn't matter because the truth still wins out and just go everywhere and succeed. Sorry, it's probably handing on now.
Yeah. Who was the author?
Luke, the same guy who wrote the Gospel book.
Yeah.
So.
You didn't talk about authorship at all. No. Do we know that Luke, as in the people that the church fathers assumed wrote Acts?
Yeah, with all four Gospels are anonymous. The authors don't identify themselves, and people argue heavily over who wrote the Gospel of John, because John was a direct eyewitness, and so if you want to deny the authenticity or the truthfulness, you have to kind of get rid of John. All right.
And likewise with Matthew. Matthew was one of the disciples. So the authorship of Matthew and John are heavily contested. With Mark and Luke, neither Mark nor Luke were disciples. Mark probably met Jesus, but Luke didn't. So there's not so much hanging. There's not so much hanging on the authorship of Luke, because he never claims to be a direct eyewitness.
I think it's fair to say that within 100 years, within almost living memory, people who knew enough got on record, yes, that's who we believe it was. So
Yes.
it's within a relatively short time.
Did they associate that Luke, as in the author of Luke Acts, with the same Luke that you talked about, and Paul refers to Luke three times, or?
Yeah, I think most people would accept that they're talking about the same person.
Yeah.
But like, you can't prove that Luke
wrote
Luke and Acts, but nobody really is worried about it.
Yeah, and here's why. Because what makes Luke act so important isn't that he was Paul's doctor, even though you find that out somewhere else in the New Testament. The main reason why Luke Acts is important is because the authorship, what gives that guy credibility is what's actually in the documents themselves, and that's that I have done really careful research on this stuff. And I've spoken, I wasn't an eyewitness, but I've spoken to a lot who have. And later on, when I get to Acts, I'll actually tell you some of who those people were, James, so on and so forth. So that's actually part of the thing. Whether the guy's name was Phil, maybe the guy's name was Bob, it doesn't really matter. The documents themselves indicate that he was carefully investigating from eyewitnesses. And the language that he uses, as you said, is very well educated. This isn't a schmuck kind of just chucking a few things together. This is a guy who's even if he's not a doctor, he's not working. He's a person who very carefully knows how to write things down systematically. He's an academic in a lot of ways. And that means that he's going to have an extra degree of credibility just because of that. And that, whether it's Luke or Phil or Bob or anyone, that's actually in the document itself.
No, I was just interested in whether or not there's two Lukes or if there's just one Luke.
There's just one writer, whatever.
Obviously, yeah.
Now, before we wrap up, we are nearly about to wrap up. But I just want to give you guys the opportunity to make a comment if you'd like to, because that seems fair.
They were very nice. They come along because I invited them.
So, I take it you're familiar with the passage?
Not really.
Not really. Okay. So, you know the passage fairly well now.
Yeah. Like a little bit more.
A little bit more. What are your impressions, or what sticks with you? What's in your head now about it?
The usual of a bit. Yeah, a long way, and several times actually. I think I also believe that it is on the board.
In root.
Yeah, that's the natural.
Not quite sure about like the other background about it.
You can't get that from what we've looked at tonight. So then we start to talk using extra knowledge, don't we?
Yeah.
So that's fair enough. That's cool. Yeah. Now, right back there. Did you want to know?
Thanks very much for operating the camera.
Yeah, great job.
We've had a lovely time talking, and I am definitely persuaded that he was on the boat, and I also take the point that makes the things that he said, that Jesus said in Luke. Well, I mean, I believe it's dead anyway, but you know, he clearly wrote this before 70 AD. So, yeah. Okay, back to you.
Where's my bottle of wine?
Oh, sorry. Because you do so much. Yeah, and we do thank you. We do thank you for everything, but especially tonight for sharing this in such a a clear way. Yeah.
I think it was a good way to start 2004.
Look at it, may I comment about next
Oh,
meeting?
yeah. Sorry.
May I comment about next meeting?
Just before you do, right? Jasmine, sorry.
I was just going to say that usually for non-Christians, the thing is, what you have to make clear is, if you talk about Christians, you always think, okay, Jesus, okay, God, okay, Jesus must be God. You know, it's like kind of confusion they would have. But, you know, going through these, stories, it's clearly stating that Jesus is not actually God. So I'm just saying that it's a fact that, it is clearly that I have learned today anyway, because it wasn't really quite consistent. You read things, you say that, there's Christians out there, but you never attend these kind of talks and like TV talks. Okay, that's the fact that it's not. It's not God.
Sorry?
God or something?
Oh, sorry, that's a complication in theology. No, like part of what Trinitarian stuff is a bit more complicated, but we're saying that Jesus is God, but yeah, extra fun stuff that I'll explain I think later.
But that you don't get that from this text, right?
Yeah.
Fair enough. Okay, what you do get from this text, if you believe that Luke was on the boat, is that Jesus made some incredible predictions before they came true, because Luke wrote them before they came true. And then, if you follow the assumptions that we do, or that some of us do, probably most of us here do, then you also believe that it truly happened, that he rose from the dead. Right? And people don't do that normally. He was, because God can't die. I mean, God can't stay dead. Yeah.
Cool.
Anyway. No, I don't know. Is that okay, or is that someone like that?
Great.
When, it's interesting, like when Jesus called the disciples, they could have come up and said, look, first of all, I've got 1,000 questions here that I'm going to ask you before I actually make the decision and come and follow you. And it says, no, it didn't happen like that. And he said to them, follow me. And so they did. They came along for the ride. and they would have had 1,000 questions as they went. But they kind of answered as they had that experience of me first. So, sure, there are 1,000 questions. But ultimately, Jesus says, follow me and come along for the ride and you'll find out a lot of interesting stuff.
The next meeting,
Yes,
we've got John Hartnett coming, who's a professor of physics and he's working at Adelaide University. I knew him 7 years ago, and he was a professor of physics at Western Australia University in Perth, Western Australia. He actually manufactures extremely precise clocks using very large ruby crystals.
Rubies are nice.
Rubies are not dug up out of the ground, but made by man very carefully. The ruby crystal can vibrate very, very accurately when it's stimulated by electric currents, and he makes the most precise clock in the world, without a doubt. And it's the companion clock that goes with an atomic clock. So any university that wants an atomic clock, come to John Hartnett and say, can we have one of your ruby clocks to control our atomic clock? You've got to have them together. And you can only use an atomic clock really reliably if the ruby clock is keeping very good time along with it. Otherwise it's just a vibrating thing that doesn't tell you time at all. John Hartnett is a Christian and a young earth creationist, and when you go to the other extreme from young earth creationism, you find that people base a lot of their thinking on the Big Bang, that the universe, they've conceded that the universe did have a beginning, but they try to tell the story that it didn't begin with God. It began by itself without God. And that first event is commonly called the Big Bang.
There are plenty of people who do believe in God and do believe that God created but that he created a long time ago when he used evolution. So you can't.
We're starting to get into next week's meeting.
Oh,
We're going to
sorry.
discuss the next fortnight's meeting.
What John Hartnett will do is to put some really serious questions out there about the Big Bang Theory. And I think it's very interesting to get some more skeptics active and thinking about, is it really so, when you get told these stories. And I'm going to really, really enjoy his visit. I hope you do too. I think he can talk in a manner that you will have a good gist and understanding of. But you can also ask him some very deep questions if you know more about that topic too.
Excellent. I'm going to be here.
Okay.
Well, God willing.
That's
feel free to hang around and talk with the chairs away. But otherwise, that's the end for me. Thanks.